In this video, we're going to talk about constructors. Now, constructors are a very common feature that is added to most classes. And what it is it's a special type of method that will automatically run when somebody creates an object from your class. And what they're typically used for is to set some initial values. The initial values of your fields, which are also associated with something called an attribute. We'll talk about the difference here in just a bit. So here's the same class you used in the lab a few minutes ago. We've seen it before. I've got the first name. I've got the first name attributes only, of course. So I guess I should say this is what we started off earlier. But I've added a constructor, and here is what it looks like. You define it with a special name. It's underscore underscore, so there's actually two underscores there. INIT, which stands for initialize. Two more underscores. The word self to indicate that it's a method. And then you go through and you define whatever parameters you want in addition to self. Now, self is kind of weird because you don't actually pass parameters, or excuse me, arguments into it. It's just a flag indicating that it's used with object instances. In other words, oops, wrong button. In other words, when I go through and I make an object from this class, like down here, what's going to happen is that as soon as I make one, it's going to run this code. It automatically runs that code. And so what I'm going to have to do is, let me scroll down a bit and do that again. As soon as I go through and tell it to make me a brand new person object, what it's going to do is it's going to make me a person object, and it's going to pass in the argument Bob into the first parameter. Now, I guess this is the 0th parameter, and the word self indicates that I'm working with an object instance. We made a method, I think, in the last module, in which case we didn't use the word self, and that's because we weren't working with if we weren't working with an object instance, we didn't have to have it. If I did have you include self, then it was because I was working with an object instance. We'll talk a little bit more about this later on when we get into something called static methods. But for right now, just assume that when you make a constructor, you want to go ahead and put the word self, just like you do when you make any other method that you want to be used by an object. Now, you can have as many of these parameters as you want. You just make a comma separate list of parameters, so like first name, last name, phone number, address, and then when you make the object, you just go through and make a comma separate list of arguments. This is why when you make a new object, it looks like you're calling a function. That's because you are calling the constructor function to tell it to create or construct a brand new object for you. And that's why the syntax looks like this. You may remember that when I didn't have the constructor, we still use the parentheses with no arguments passed in. That's because there will always be a little invisible constructor even if you don't make one. Python just takes care of it behind the scenes, invisible to you. But if you define a constructor, it'll use yours, and then you can add in your own extra features, such as the ability to go ahead and set the field value to whatever the value was for the parameter. Now, this is optional. It means that you don't have to do the next line of code. This is kind of grayed out, in which case I would go ahead and explicitly say first name is equal to Bob. I have passed Bob into the constructor when I made the object, which means I don't have to do the next line of code. It doesn't mean I can't do it. It just means I don't have to. It's an optional way of setting the values for your fields. Now, in Python, it's a little confusing. Yeah, I don't know if confusing is the right word, but it's a little different. You refer to the field by using self, and that makes some kind of sense because again it's talking about the object's copy of the data. So you want to use the pronoun to say its self, and then of course the name of the field. And when you do this, this becomes what they call an attribute. Attributes define, allow you to go ahead and define the value or set the value of a field. We'll talk a little bit more about attributes in a bit as well. But basically all it is when you hear the word attributes, you're talking about something that will set the field. Like many times, it's probably easiest to go ahead and try it out yourself. So we're going to go ahead and move on to a lab where you go ahead and create your own constructor for the person class. I'll see you there.